I joked that the widow next door was practically my wife. She looked at me and asked, "What's stopping us?" The joke left my mouth on a Sunday evening in November, standing on her porch in the dark with a casserole dish I'd just carried across 2 driveways, and the moment it did, I knew I'd meant every word of it. She was holding the door open with one hand and a dish towel in the other, and I said it the way you say the truest things, half laughing, voice just quiet enough that it could pass as nothing if she wanted it to. Between the cooking and the fixing and the showing up, at this point you're practically my wife. She didn't laugh. She looked at me in the specific way she had, the way where she was deciding something before she spoke. And then she said, very evenly, "What's stopping us?" I had no answer. The porch light was on, and the casserole was warm, and I had nothing. Her name was Miriam. She had moved into the house next door 3 years before that porch moment, 6 months after her husband, Thomas, died of a cardiac event at 51. He had been a quiet, decent man. I'd known him the way you know a good neighbor. Well enough to wave, well enough to help him carry a ladder one Saturday when it was tipping, well enough to feel the specific wrongness of his driveway sitting empty when it hadn't been empty before. His death left Miriam in a house that was slightly too large for one person, and that she had no intention of leaving, because it was the house she and Thomas had chosen together, and leaving felt, she told me once, like giving something of his away that wasn't hers to give. I had been living next door for 7 years. I was 53, widowed myself. My wife, Ellen, had died 4 years before Miriam moved in, a long illness and a longer grief that I had mostly finished by the time the moving truck arrived next door, or finished enough to be functional, which is not the same thing, but is the thing you work toward. I had a daughter in another city, a job that occupied the right amount of time, a house that was also slightly too large for one person, and that I was not leaving either. We became neighbors in the real sense of the word gradually, through the unremarkable mechanisms of proximity. I helped her with the garbage cans the first winter because she hadn't figured out the pickup schedule yet, and I had. She brought over bread she'd baked because she'd made too much, which turned out to be a recurring condition. She always made too much of everything and had no one to absorb the surplus. I shoveled her walk without asking after the first big snow because I was already out there, and it seemed absurd not to. She returned this 3 weeks later by leaving a container of soup on my porch with a note that said only, "For the walk." We existed in a comfortable, practical, increasingly warm adjacency for months before it became something you'd call friendship, and longer still before I understood what it had actually become. What you have to understand about Miriam is the quality of her attention. She is the kind of person who remembers what you said 6 months ago, not because she was cataloging you, but because she was genuinely listening. And genuinely listening is rarer than people admit. She remembered that my daughter's name was Claire, and that Claire was a physical therapist, and that Claire and I talked on the phone every Sunday evening, which was why I was usually back inside by 7. She remembered that I took my coffee black, not as a preference, but as a discipline, because I'd given up the sugar after Ellen's illness for reasons I'd explained once and didn't expect anyone to retain. She retained it. She was the kind of neighbor who, by the end of the first year, felt less like a neighbor and more like someone who had been paying attention to you in the particular way that only a handful of people ever bother to. I was paying attention too, though I kept this carefully filed in a place I didn't visit openly. Miriam had a son named Daniel, 28, living a few states away, working in logistics. He called her regularly and visited on holidays, and was, by all evidence, a good son in the general sense. He was also, I would learn gradually, a son who had developed a position on his mother's life, and specifically on the question of the house. He believed the house was too large for her, too expensive to maintain on her income alone, and too far from him to be practical in an emergency. He had a solution. She should sell, take the equity, and move to an apartment complex 40 minutes from his city that had a waiting list he had already put her name on without telling her. I learned about this on a rainy Tuesday in January, 14 months after she'd moved in. She came to the door when I knocked to return a pie plate, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. Not dramatically, just the specific absence of the ease that was usually there when she answered the door. She told me to come in. We sat at the kitchen table, and she told me about the waiting list. "He put your name on a list for an apartment," I said. Without asking, I repeated. "He says he's just keeping options open." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "But I know Daniel. Keeping options open means he's already decided, and he's managing the timeline. What do you want to do?" She looked at the table for a moment. "I want to stay in my house. I want to keep Thomas's garden. I want to walk to the post office and know the woman at the counter's name and come home to a street where people know my name back." She looked up. "Is that so small a thing to want?" "No," I said. "It's exactly the right thing to want. Daniel thinks I'm hiding from the future in the past. Daniel doesn't live here." She looked at me steadily. "No, he doesn't." I drove home that night, 2 driveways, 40 seconds, and sat in my own kitchen thinking about a woman who had correctly identified what she wanted and was about to be managed out of it by someone who loved her and was wrong. I thought about the waiting list, which had her name on it without her consent. I thought about what it means to have your future made for you by someone who has decided they know better. I had watched Ellen navigate that with her doctors in the last year of her illness, the cheerful institutional momentum that required real effort to resist. And I had some experience with what it cost to be the person who helped push back. The next day I looked up the apartment complex. This took about 20 minutes. It was fine, clean, managed, adequate parking, a fitness center and a community room, and a reasonable proximity to a grocery store. It was also, irrefutably, generic in the way that places become generic when they are designed for a demographic rather than a person. I looked at the waiting list policy, which was available on the complex's website because they wanted prospective residents to understand how it worked. Names could be added by a family member. Removal required a written request from the named individual. Miriam's name was on a list for an apartment she had never agreed to consider, and removing it required her to initiate an action she didn't yet know she needed to take. There was also a secondary thing I noticed, which was that the complex had a no-pet policy, and Miriam had a cat, a gray, independent-minded animal named Garrison, who had been Thomas's, and who had remained after, as cats tend to do, quietly outlasting the circumstances that produced him. Garrison could not go to this apartment. I did not know if Daniel had considered Garrison. I suspected he had not considered Garrison. I printed the waiting list policy and the no-pet clause and brought both to her on Thursday. She read both documents. She read the waiting list policy twice and the no-pet clause once. Then she set them on the kitchen table and looked at me. "He can't force me to move." "No, but he can create conditions that make staying feel like the harder choice, more contested, more administrative, more like something you have to defend again every few months." The waiting list is a foot in a door. Once there's a specific unit available and a specific move-in date and a deposit conversation, the abstract becomes concrete, and concrete is much harder to resist, so I take my name off before it gets there. In writing. And you tell Daniel you've done it at the same time, so the decision is established before the conversation begins. That way there's nothing left to negotiate. It's done, and you're telling him about it, not asking for his response. She was quiet for a moment. He'll be hurt that I didn't talk to him first. He didn't talk to you first. She looked at the table. No, he didn't. A pause. He worries about me. That's the thing. It's not malicious. He genuinely worries. I know. And he's wrong about what you need, but he's not wrong to worry. He just needs to learn that worrying about you doesn't mean he gets to decide for you. The clearest way to teach someone that is to make a decision clearly and stand behind it. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up the documents and her phone and went to her own kitchen. I stayed in mine. She called Daniel that evening. I don't know exactly what was said, because it wasn't mine to know and she didn't offer and I didn't ask. What I know is that she knocked on my door an hour later, standing in the doorway in her coat, because she'd come straight from her car, and she said it had gone the way honest, difficult conversations go when you've had the courage to have them honestly. Hard while it was happening and cleaner immediately after. She'd sent the written removal request before she'd called him, so he received it while they were on the phone, which was either excellent or terrible timing depending on your perspective. He called back the following morning. That conversation had been better. He apologized, she said. Not a clean apology, but he tried, and he meant it. And that's what an imperfect apology from a person who loves you looks like. That counts for quite a lot. He still thinks the house is too large for one person. He might not be entirely wrong about the maintenance question. That's separate from whether it's your decision. She tilted her head at me. Would you say that to him, if he were standing here? Yes. Why? Because it's true. And because you're better served by people who tell you true things than by people who only tell you things that help. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I chose not to examine too carefully, and then she said, "Why are you so consistently useful?" Low bar. You've had the other kind lately. She laughed, the real laugh, not the social one, and that was the right ending for that conversation. Garrison came and sat on my foot, which he did occasionally when he was making a point of some kind, and the three of us stood in the doorway for another moment before she went home. The months after the waiting list episode settled into a rhythm I had no good name for, which was itself information I was ignoring. We cooked for each other on a loosely alternating schedule that had never been formally established, but operated with the reliability of a formal arrangement. She would make something on a Tuesday and bring half of it over, or I would appear at her door on a Saturday with something from the grill, and she would supply everything else without discussion. The salad and the bread, and the opening of the right wine at the right time. Neither of us had agreed to this. It had just become the shape of the week. She came over when the gutter needed clearing, because she'd learned I had an extendable ladder that reached her second story, and that I would use it without commentary, or the implicit invoice that some help comes with. I came over when her internet failed. 3 times in 4 months, which was a router problem that required moving a bookcase she couldn't move alone, and which I fixed on the 3rd visit by relocating the router entirely to a position I should have identified the first time. She thanked me by making dinner. This was the whole economy of us, and it was effortless, in a way that only things with deep roots are effortless. Things that seem easy because they are actually very well established. Thomas had done these things for her, the gutters and the furniture and the practical adjacency, and now I did them. Neither of us named this directly, because naming it would have required naming other things too. And we were both, I think, being careful with the naming. Garrison learned to come to my door on his own sometime in the spring of that year. I noticed him sitting on my porch one morning, as though he had made a decision and was waiting for me to confirm it was acceptable. I let him in. After that, it became intermittent. Some days he was there when I opened the door. Some days, he wasn't, operating on a schedule only he understood. Miriam found this amusing in a way that I suspected was not entirely about the cat. Thomas's garden was in her backyard, raised beds he had built and planted, a project he'd started the spring before he died and had been planning to expand. She had kept it going, learning as she went, with a stubbornness that I found quietly extraordinary. She didn't garden. Thomas had. But she was not going to let what he built fall apart, so she learned. Badly at first, and then better. And by the second summer, the beds were producing tomatoes and herbs, and one ambitious squash situation that overran its assigned area significantly. She brought me the surplus, which was considerable. In return, I helped her build a trellis for the squash in July, which took most of a Saturday and involved a level of precision that she found amusing and that I found necessary. That Saturday was the first time I understood clearly that I was in trouble. We were in her backyard in the afternoon heat, the trellis half assembled between us, and she was reading me the instructions aloud, with a running editorial commentary on the quality of the writing. Whoever had written them had apparently never built a trellis and had confused confidence with clarity, and she had strong opinions about this in a way that was making it very difficult to actually build anything, and I was laughing in a way I hadn't laughed in years. Not performed laughter, not the social kind you produce in groups because the room expects it. The involuntary kind. The kind that happens when someone surprises you with a joke you didn't see coming. When someone is funnier than you expected, and also funnier than they're trying to be, which is the rarest combination and the one that gets you. She caught me at it and said, "What?" And I said, "Nothing. Keep reading." And she gave me a look that said she did not believe me and went back to the instructions, and I thought, I am in serious trouble. And I have been for some time, and I have been calling it something else because the something else fit better in the space we occupied. I filed this thought and went back to the trellis. I was very precise about the trellis. Precision was what I had available. That was August. I did not say anything. There was, in my careful estimation, nothing useful to say. She was 3 years from Thomas. I was 7 years from Ellen. The friendship between us was something I valued with a specificity and a steadiness that I was not prepared to put at risk on something I couldn't yet see clearly enough to name. I told myself this. I believed most of it. The part I did not believe was the part I did not look at. The second thing that threatened the equilibrium came 8 months after the waiting list resolution, and it arrived in the form of a man named Geoffrey. Geoffrey was a widower himself, 70 years old, who attended the same grief support group Miriam had been going to since Thomas died. He was pleasant enough by her account, well-meaning, socially confident. The kind of man who fills a room with a comfortable noise. He had begun paying her particular attention at the group meetings, saving the seat beside him, walking her to her car after sessions, texting her links to concerts and gallery openings with phrasing that began as friendly and was tilting into something more directional. Miriam was not interested. She had been polite about this because she is constitutionally polite. And she had discovered, as polite people always discover, that sustained politeness reads as ambiguity to someone who wants to find it there. She told me about Geoffrey on a Thursday evening in October, sitting in my kitchen while I made dinner. Nothing ambitious, just pasta and something from the garden that was still producing optimistically despite the temperature. She was on the stool she'd adopted at my kitchen island over the preceding year, the one that put her at the right angle to talk while I cooked, without either of us having to manage the awkwardness of sitting formally across from each other for a difficult conversation. We had worked out this geography without discussing it. She held her wine, and I kept my back mostly to her, and she told me about Geoffrey. Not because she wanted advice, exactly she'd said this up front, but she'd been holding it for 3 weeks, and the carrying was getting heavy. This is one of the things I value most about the way she and I talk. She announces her own needs at the beginning, so you know whether she wants you to fix something or just be there while she thinks out loud. She has an unusual self-awareness about this. Most people want one thing and ask for another, and are frustrated when they get what they asked for. "He's not a bad person," she said. "No. He's just reading something in my politeness that isn't there. That's a common misread. I don't know how to be clearer without being cruel." "You can be clear without being cruel," I said. "They aren't actually the same. Kindness that preserves someone's false hope isn't kindness. It's just your own comfort in the short term at his expense in the long one." She was quiet for a moment. "That's harder than it sounds. You've done harder. You called Daniel, removed your own name from a list without his permission to do so, and had the direct version of that conversation. This is smaller than that. Daniel didn't have feelings for me. No, but the structure is the same. Someone has built a story about what your life should look like. You're the only one who can tell them the story is wrong, and the clearer you tell it, the kinder it is in the end. Ambiguity is not mercy. It's postponement." She turned her wine glass slowly in her hands. "When did you get so wise about this?" "I'm not wise about it. I watched someone I loved do it badly once, and understand exactly what the alternative costs." She looked at me then with a directness that I held without looking away. "Ellen?" "Ellen," she nodded slowly. "Thomas told me what I wanted to hear," she said. "Not always, but often enough that I got out of practice hearing the other kind." A pause. It was one of his better qualities and one of his worse ones. This was the first thing she had ever said about Thomas that was not entirely warm, and the balance of it, the precision of the accounting, told me exactly how much she had thought about it, and for how long. "You know the difference now," I said. "I'm learning it," she said. "I didn't before." She went to the grief group the following week. She came to my door afterward, which had become the way most Thursdays ended, not arranged, just frequently the direction the evening moved. She sat on the porch instead of coming inside, which I had learned meant she wanted to process something in open air rather than contained space. I sat with her. She said she'd spoken to Jeffrey before the meeting. She'd been clear. He had been, to his credit, decent about it, had listened, had said he understood, had not made a scene. The meeting itself had been fine. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Like I should have done it 3 weeks ago," she said. "And like, I'm glad you said that thing about ambiguity not being mercy. I had convinced myself it was." We stayed on the porch for another 40 minutes talking about nothing urgent. The garden, the neighbor 2 houses down who had painted his shutters a color that required discussion, whether the grocery store's new layout was an improvement or an act of aggression. When she went home, I stayed in my chair in the dark and thought about what it means to learn the difference between what you want to hear and what you need to hear. Ellen had told me hard things. It was one of the things I had loved most about her, one of the things I missed with the most specificity. The kind of missing that has a precise shape rather than a general ache. I had not thought until that porch evening in October that I had found someone else who did it. The third thing that changed the shape of everything happened in the spring, and it was Daniel again, but differently. He came to visit in April, his first extended visit since the waiting list episode. I didn't see him at first. I was away for 2 days and came back to find an unfamiliar car in her driveway and lights on in the back of her house. I texted to say I was back if she needed anything. She texted, "Dinner tomorrow? Daniel's here. He'd like to meet you." I said yes. Dinner was a Thursday. Miriam made something that took 3 hours and smelled extraordinary from the moment I stepped onto her porch. Thomas's mother's recipe for a lamb dish, she told me when I asked. Something she made only for occasions, that warranted it. I brought wine. I shook Daniel's hand at the door and took his measure the way you take the measure of someone important to someone important to you. He was tall, darker than his mother, with a directness in the handshake that told you he was the kind of person who had decided what he thought of you before the conversation started and was prepared to revise. Over dinner, he was courteous and curious in a way that had calibration behind it. The questions he asked were polite on the surface and considerably more purposeful underneath. How long had I been in the neighborhood? What was my work? Had I known Thomas at all? And what had I made of him? Then, what had my wife's illness been like? This last question he asked carefully, not intrusively, but he asked it, and we both understood why. He was establishing whether I was a person who understood grief from the inside or only from the outside, whether I was someone who had lost someone or merely someone who had been nearby while his mother lost someone. The distinction mattered to him, and he was right that it mattered. I answered honestly. He listened with his mother's quality of attention, which is to say completely, without the partial distraction that most people bring to conversations they think they already understand. By the time Miriam brought the bread, there was something in the room that felt like the careful beginning of a second verdict. The one that forms after the first impression has been tested. After dinner, Miriam went to the kitchen to make coffee, and Daniel and I were alone at the table for perhaps 4 minutes. He looked at the tablecloth for a moment, and then looked at me. "She's happy," he said. "She hasn't been happy like this since before my father got sick." I mean that exactly, before he got sick, not just before he died. The last 2 years with him were hard. She held it all very quietly. And then he was gone, and she moved here, and she's been different, better. I can hear it in her voice every time I call. I waited. "I want to tell you I disapprove of whatever this is," he said, "because you're older, and you're her neighbor, and I'm her son, and there's supposed to be a script for this situation where I'm suspicious and protective, and she has to talk me around. But I don't disapprove. I just want you to know that I can see what's happening, and that I think it's good, and that if you weren't the cause of it, I'd be looking for it somewhere else." I said, carefully, "I'm not sure exactly what you're seeing." He looked at me with a patience that was almost fond. "Yes, you do," he said. Miriam came back with coffee. We did not continue the conversation, but it had been had. It sat in the room for the rest of the evening in the way true things sit in a room once they've been said aloud, invisibly and completely, changing the shape of everything around them without anyone acknowledging that the shape has changed. The Sunday after Daniel left, Miriam made the casserole, a different recipe from the lamb, something weeknight and practical, and sent me a text that said, "Come get this before I eat it all." I walked over at 6. She handed it to me in the dish at the door, and I made some remark about getting the recipe. And she said it was Thomas's too, and I said Thomas apparently had excellent taste, and she smiled in the way she smiles when something lands the way she hoped it would. And then I said the thing I'd been almost saying for 3 years. Between the cooking and the fixing and the showing up, at this point, you're practically my wife. I laughed. She did not. She looked at me. 1 beat, 2 beats, the porch light between us. And then, what's stopping us? I set the casserole dish on the porch railing. I thought about Ellen, whom I had loved truly, and whose absence had taught me what it costs to take love for granted. I thought about Thomas, a man I had known only well enough to miss his presence on this street, who had built raised garden beds in the spring and not lived to expand them. I thought about 3 years of snow shoveled and soup left on porches and extendable ladders and trellis projects, and Thursday evenings that ended on a porch in the dark. I thought about a dinner table and Daniel saying she hasn't been happy like this since before my father got sick. There is a kind of knowing that accumulates slowly, the way snow accumulates, each flake unremarkable, the accumulation undeniable. I had been standing in it for some time. I had been calling it something else. Nothing, I said. There is absolutely nothing stopping us. She looked at me for a moment longer, with the full, careful attention that she gives to things that matter to her. Then, she stepped back and held the door open, and I picked up the casserole, and I went inside. We did not announce anything. There was no conversation about definitions or labels or what to tell people or how to explain it to the neighbors who were not us. There was a Sunday evening in her kitchen and coffee after, and the easy, unhurried quality of people who have nothing left to perform for each other. There was Monday, which was a normal Monday, distinguished from the Mondays before it only by the way I noticed the normalness of it. Noticed it with something I recognized, after a moment, as relief. Tuesday was also normal. There was the following Saturday at the farmer's market. The two of us walking the stalls in the slow manner of people who have nowhere more important to be, buying things neither of us strictly needed, stopping at a stall that sold handmade preserves for long enough that the woman running it seemed to think we were going to buy all of them. We bought 2 jars. We split them down the middle. This is the kind of thing that tells you more about a relationship than most conversations do. I called Claire that Sunday at the usual time. She asked how the week had been. I told her, including the part that was Miriam, which took some managing, because telling your adult daughter that you are, at 53, in the beginning of something with the woman next door, requires a certain steadiness in the delivery. I did my best. There was a silence on the line, not long, not uncomfortable, but unmistakably the silence of a daughter receiving information about her father that is complicated and also not complicated at all, that requires her to feel several things simultaneously without letting any of them win before she's ready. Then she said, "Is she good to you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is she good to you the way Mom was?" I thought about this honestly before I answered. I said, "Differently, but yes." She said, "Then I'm glad, Dad. It was not a long conversation about it. It was the right length for what it needed to be." Miriam told Daniel on a Tuesday. He was not surprised, which she reported to me later with a specific mix of exasperation and fondness that was itself the clearest possible window into their entire relationship. He said only, "I know. I could tell at dinner." She said, "You could have told me." He said, "I thought you already knew." She said, "I knew something. I didn't know the word for it." He said, "Well, now you do." This exchange, as she described it to me, lasted approximately 90 seconds and resolved a year's worth of mutual awareness without any of the drama either of them had been bracing for. This is also something that tells you about people. The garden came back in April, as it does every year, indifferent to human arrangements. She had added a new bed over the winter, wider than the ones Thomas had built, lower to the ground to accommodate her knees. With a drainage adjustment she'd worked out from a combination of reading and 2 failed experiments, and a YouTube video she mentioned watching 11 times. She showed it to me on a Saturday morning with the quiet, specific pride of someone who has done a difficult thing and did not require an audience for the doing of it. Just the doing and the result. I asked what she was putting in it. She listed things, more tomatoes, a section she was dedicating to herbs, an ambitious plan for pole beans that she described with full awareness that the pole beans might not cooperate. I said I'd take the tomatoes when they came in. She said that was already assumed. Thomas built the first beds in the spring before he died. Miriam built the next one alone, in a winter when the ground was frozen and the project was just her. and her research, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that a thing is going to happen. This seems to me like exactly the story a life should be able to tell about itself. That what someone leaves behind does not stay only as memorial. That it becomes the ground for the next thing, which is built with your own hands, by your own effort, in your own time. That the two things, what was and what is, can coexist without the second one erasing the first. I did not always believe this was possible. I believe it now. Ellen knew I would be fine. She said so, specifically in one of the last clear conversations we had before the illness took the clarity. I did not believe her at the time because the time was exactly wrong for believing it. You do not believe you will be fine when fine seems like a category that no longer applies to you. She was right. She was, in my experience, right about most things regarding me, more reliably than I was right about myself. She had a clear eye for me. I miss the clear eye as much as I miss anything. Thomas left behind raised garden beds and a recipe for lamb, and a woman who learned to build a trellis because the squash needed one, and there was no one else to do it. I am the neighbor who showed up with an extendable ladder and stayed. Not because I planned to, not because anyone asked me to in so many words, but because proximity and attention given enough time produce a kind of knowing that is hard to walk back from once you have it. And I did not want to walk back from it. I had been standing at the edge of that knowing for a year and calling it something else, and then she asked me, on a porch in November with the light on and a casserole between us, to just say the true thing. I said it. It was the right thing to say, and I have not stopped being glad I said it. The casserole dish is still in her kitchen. I have not returned it. She has not asked for it back. I believe we have silently agreed, in the way we agree on most things, that the dish was never the point. It was just the reason I was standing on the porch when she asked the real question. The reason no longer matters. The question does. Have you ever found yourself standing in the ordinary middle of someone's life, carrying a dish across a driveway, fixing a gutter, staying 30 minutes longer than you meant to, and realized you had been calling it neighborliness because the true name for it felt like too much to claim? Who is the person whose door you've been knocking on with one excuse or another for longer than you've been honest about? And what is the one real thing you've been waiting for the right moment to say? If this story reached you at the right moment, subscribe. There is another one, waiting.